So maybe we'll see Jason tap out for Thrumming Stone, and then Rebel can do the combo again.
What do we got here? Oh, we got the storm aura.
Okay. So so Rebel channeled Moonstare prototype on the aura shards in response to
I missed
enchantment.
That explains the.
Wait, we have the tokens. What level of production is this that we have?
Yeah. Andy doesn't mess around.
This is crazy. Imagine how productive you could be as a human being if you didn't build an Ornithopter Cube and you put this level of
but what would be the point?
Effort into anything?
What's the point of productivity if you can't build an Ornithopter Cube?
I mean that's fair. I mean,
Croson adaptation tokens.
Liz, and who am I to talk? I'm the guy watching the Ornithopter Cube. That's even worse than building it.
Good. Great. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is, as always, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony. Lived his worst nightmare this weekend, Maddox.
I lived my worst nightmare. What? I don't get it.
Well, my people on the ground tell me, LOL, Bones just announced that Vertex will be broadcast shuffling, and the whole room started cheering for Anthony. His worst nightmare is what I hear happened.
Ooh, I did literally put my hands over my head and curl into a ball.
Turn beet red as everyone's like, the shuffling guy's here!
Well, I was a little bit nervous because, I'm pretty confident in the abstract theory of the shuffling method that I wrote an article about recently, and I'm confident that it is the best method for one person to do it, but I was a little bit nervous about what happens when, the theory hits the real complicated, weird world we live in and people. And
I know you were also worried about just communicating it briefly and also serializing it, if you could, so that multiple people could help in one.
Exactly. Like how do you figure out how to coordinate people and parallelize different portions of it. And, it's just the feeling of, okay, we're going to do this. And you start taking cards out of boxes and it's just people's reflexes. Just, all right, I'm going to grab a stack and start shuffling. And it's like, no, let's stop and coordinate. But overall, it went pretty well. It did take, it was a little rocky the first go around, but people kind of got the hang of it, and people, I think, sort of came up with some methods for, like, okay, let's put one person in charge, they're going to manage all the stacks, like pass them out, have everybody shuffle, and then hand them back and redistribute them. And it seemed like after at least the second or third round, there was at least one person in every pod that was willing to sort of take charge, and it went pretty quickly.
That's awesome, and also seems like the best way to actually spread this method. Like, even if people read the article, I could see them being like, cool, I read that, looked at the funny visualizations, and had a good time, but maybe not internalizing it.
Right.
But once you've done it, 6 times over the weekend, however many drafts there were at this event, then, it seems like you're just going to do it that way all the time.
Yeah, I mean, and I obviously did not write the article expecting that everybody would just read it and be like, oh, this is now the correct method. We're all going to change overnight. Because
but it seems like they did.
That's not how things work. But it seems like this was, a faster rate of change than I expected. And I'm glad that I've been able to have a positive impact on shuffling cubes. That's all I've ever really wanted.
Man, I'm sad to have missed this weekend. I was home with a sad dog.
I was sad to miss you too. Everybody missed you.
Playing a bunch of Magic would have been great, but I think I'm most sad I missed this moment. I would have loved to see this in real life.
This last week, I was lucky enough to be on Recross the Paths, which is Cade Goforth's podcast, where he interviews people about their cube, about their Magic experience, and that was a lot of fun. So if you want to listen to me talk for another hour about Cube, you can go check that out. There are also some other great episodes. I especially recommend the episodes with Roja and with Arlo that were just really fun listens. On the episode, we just talked about a lot of the sort of like tools and little projects that I've been working on, which we've talked about in some degree on Lucky Paper, but yeah, if you want to just hear me ramble more, you can do that.
Yeah, without someone interrupting you like me the entire time, which is a bonus.
That's fair. Yeah, it's a little different vibe.
This week's episode, Anthony, is just a tournament report. I want to hear about Vertex. All I know is that you went. I saw that you've got 2 pins to your name, and I saw that Julian from our local playgroup won. Other than that, I know nothing about how the event went, so I'm curious to hear about your drafts, the cubes you played, what you thought about them, what you learned. And then I recorded the 100 Ornithopters Unite draft, which is something I was in New York last week to record, that at time of recording has not been released to the public, but by the time this episode comes out, will have happened on the previous Thursday, and that VOD will be up, and I will post a link to that VOD if you missed the live stream, so you can watch the draft I'm talking about.
So what's actually going to be streamed? Is it every single match, or just following one person throughout the tournament?
So they filmed a featured drafter, and so we're going to see a draft from the view of the featured drafter.
That's always super fun.
That drafter's match, and then we see the winner of that match play the winner of the next match. They follow the winners up basically through the finals. By the time this comes out, I won't be spoiling anything, but I'm going to spoil it for you a little bit because I want to give a little bit of a report on what I learned in that draft. But I think we should start with Vertex.
Okay, let's jump into it. So Vertex was, overall, it was a fantastic event. This was about 100 people. It took place in Philadelphia, organized by Greg, and Judge Bones was there to make everything work with his magic, his expertise, having run a bunch of these events. And like a bunch of these events previously, everybody got to do rank choice, pick out which cubes they want to draft, and we drafted... There were 4 total drafts that led to a top 8 in the 5th round, and also some open play at that time.
Okay. And I guess just real quick, in case somebody doesn't know what we're talking about, if you're a new listener, we are talking about a small local cube event that happened in Philadelphia last weekend, and there have been a bunch of these cropping up all over the place, so you can check out our website, luckypaper.co/events, to see a list of all the events that are upcoming, at least that I know about, and I think I know about the vast majority of them. And it's a kind of new type of Magic event that has been getting more and more popular, where you just get a bunch of cubes and a bunch of people in the same room for a weekend, use this great software that Gwen from Cube Cobra built to run the tournament, and yeah, play a bunch of great cube.
Yeah, and it was overall just like great vibes. Everybody was super friendly. The cubes were fun, and it was a lot of fun to just play a whole bunch of Magic over the course of a weekend. And also just great to see this kind of structure that's emerged over the last couple of years. You know, CubeCon was kind of the first thing that kind of put a stake in the ground to, yes, we can make cube events happen. And it's kind of asymptotically approaching this very refined form, and especially with Bones being at a lot of these events, things just went really smoothly. Like, cube check-in was a little bit quicker this time. Every time it feels like the labels for the cubes are a little bit better, so it's just like, oh yeah, do we have like pack sizes and pack numbers, and how many cards are we expecting? Oh, it's all right here on this convenient label in the box. So I've just been really impressed to see everything get increasingly smoothed out and improved.
Yeah, truly, I can't recommend these events enough, especially these small ones. They're all cheap. I mean, as far as like weekend-long Magic events go, and you get to play some of the best Magic you ever get to play.
One big change from other events that I've been to that are similar is they actually had lunch provided at this. Juan, who lives in Philadelphia and was helping to coordinate the event, coordinated vegetarian banh mi, which were excellent, and it was also just... It's a subtle thing that obviously it's like, oh, it's nice to get lunch included, but it also just made the event run so much more smoothly because it's so much easier to be like, oh yeah, I have 20 minutes between rounds, or, you know, whatever, I'm going to go eat a sandwich right now, rather than, you know, taking 40 minutes with everybody at the same time to scramble and figure out going to a restaurant. So I think one of the biggest challenges of these events is just timing, and it made a big impact on just making the timing a lot easier.
I forgive my horrible memory. Were you not at Steel City Cube?
Yes, but...
The food was a lot better at Vertex.
The food was a lot better.
Because Greg did provide food at Steel City Cube.
And I do enjoy a hot dog. Everybody, we are a pro hot dog podcast.
This is, we're literally on record multiple times as being a pro hot dog podcast. Jamie Oliver, come at me, bro. You're saying the food was better here.
But the food was better.
Yeah.
It was notable.
Yeah. Shout out to Juan for making that happen.
The other thing that I'll note, just as another challenge, like a lot of these events, has just been space. I mean, the actual space that we were in, it was Red Cap's Corner, a local game shop. Really cool and pretty spacious local game store overall. But still, there were 100 people in there, so tables were a little tight, hard to sometimes navigate through the aisles. So just thinking about, like, what are the last little things that could be refined is maybe just figuring out how to get things spaced out a little bit easier, or maybe honestly just setting limits for the number of people in events might make more sense.
Yeah, I imagine that's a hard thing. Like, if you're running the event, you want as many people to come as possible, especially when you're selling out and people are like banging down the doors trying to get into the event. It's really hard to turn people away.
Absolutely.
Especially for something as like kind of ambiguous as like a little more space for everyone. Like, what is that worth? Is that worth turning people away? But I definitely agree. But that's also kind of my own personal... I don't like being in confined spaces, and so that's a little bit of my own personal Piccadilly there, at least.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best that I've been to in terms of space, honestly, was Capital Cube Champs last year, which It was in a hotel which had like sort of a ballroom and then separate little restaurant space, so it wasn't the most like aesthetic best vibes.
Northern Virginia is not the most aesthetic best vibes.
But just the opportunity to be like, oh yeah, there's a space over here with a bunch of chairs that people can just kind of go and relax between events and like actually chat and have a conversation. It did just facilitate a lot of the sort of extra event communication and community that I think is really valuable about these events.
Yeah, I loved Boston Cube Party, and also they had their space get changed pretty last minute, and
That
it
was
was about as cramped as an event can be, and I was just going outside at every opportunity. If I had 2 minutes, I was leaving the building and going and standing on the sidewalk.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like we mentioned, we did have a little bit more structured shuffling, and as far as like first outing for trying to have a little bit more of a structured approach to people shuffling at the event, it went pretty well, so I'm optimistic about that being a core part that gets smoothed out and improved in events coming in the future.
All right, this concludes the shuffling report, the most important part of a tournament report that we all love.
So before we get into going through the actual drafts that I did, I wanted just to point out like a couple things that I felt about the way that I was playing that I think has been improving. We've talked a little bit about, you know, trying to learn and grow and improve as players. And something that I felt myself doing in a couple different drafts, sort of along a theme, is just paying a little bit more attention to the end of the game, if that makes sense. Like actually figuring out how is my opponent going to die and how do I make sure that happens as quickly as possible. And that includes a couple different things. One of them was just paying attention to like what my clock was. So for example, if I, you know, was doing 5 damage a turn and my opponent's at 15, I've got a 3-turn clock. And actually just paying a lot more attention to that and doing the math, I think set me up for success in a lot of games where, for example, it's like, oh yeah, I think it's worth me keeping back one creature to be able to convoke a removal spell at instant speed because it doesn't actually change the clock that I have established here.
Right.
And that made a big difference in a couple games. Related to that is also just trying to find those sort of thread the needle moments where you realize, oh, I can actually get my opponent dead here, even though they've just done something that really takes a commanding lead. You know, they just play their huge bomb that's going to kill me, but oh wait, if I remove their one blocker, I can actually just get them dead this turn, and sure, the game would otherwise be a loss if I wasn't able to thread this needle here, but paying attention and finding those moments, I think, gave me a lot of wins that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
That's some really sage advice, I think. Any game you don't win does just end up being a loss.
Yeah, when you think about everything, it just means nothing, right?
Yeah, I love that moment specifically of like your opponent plays a huge planeswalker and you're like, I ignore it and I kill you. Like that's
that's a great example.
You know,
or a huge dragon. Something else that I noticed that was just kind of funny. I'm curious if you have a similar experience, but you know, timing, as we mentioned, is kind of always an issue. Rounds always take long. I just found myself, every one of my matches was over in 30 minutes or less. I don't know if it's something about the kinds of decks that I draft or just playing fairly quickly. I didn't feel rushed at any point, but I always just found I had a ton of extra time.
I play too fast and I know it, and it is very challenging for me to slow down. And one of the advantages is I often have a lot of extra time, and one of the disadvantages is I make mistakes.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm wondering is like, should I be taking more time and slowing down, or should I just keep doing what I'm doing?
I mean, are you happy?
That's a big question for a podcast about Magic the Gathering.
You're winning a lot, so if you are playing fast, doesn't seem like it's affecting you too badly in terms of your win rate.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, should we jump into some drafts?
Please.
So, Friday night, the event didn't officially start until Saturday, where there was 2 draft in the morning, draft in the afternoon, and draft in the evening, but we got there early to check in our cubes on Friday, sort of see the event and play some casual games. I was actually kind of on the fence about drafting it all on Friday just because I knew it was going to be a weekend of a lot of Magic, and I kind of want to pace myself, so I didn't want to especially do anything too complicated or overwhelming to get myself tired out, and of course I ended up getting roped into a draft with the Cascade Cube. Nice, easy, friendly way to not overly tax your brain.
You know, it depends on your attitude. If you just go in with no expectation of thinking through all the lines, then you can have a good time. How did it go?
It went pretty well. So I've drafted this cube, I think 3 times before, and it's been one of the most challenging cubes for me that I've ever experienced. So this is Zach Barish's cube, where the first spell you cast each turn has Cascade, which means you flip over cards from the top of your library until you reveal something with lesser mana value, and you cast that as well. So it's just a lot of extra free random stuff happening. And it ends up being super complicated because you're trying to cast all these spells that you have alternate costs or cost reductions, so you can cast them cheaper to be able to cheat on the Cascade, and then build your mana curve in a very particular way in order to actually take advantage of that. And it's just really kind of mind-breaking for me, and I think I had never won certainly never a match. I don't know if I've ever won a game of this cube.
I've drafted it 2 or 3 times before, and I think won 1 match every time I've played. I've gone 1-2 every time I've drafted it, and that one, it just felt like, I played somebody else that is also new to this cube and got a little lucky, you know?
But I ended up doing pretty well. I ended up drafting an artifact deck, so I had a bunch of things with affinity for artifacts, which is obviously pretty strong because you cast a thing for very cheap once you have a couple artifacts in play. I had a Mox Opal, which ended up being pretty powerful because it meant all of my 1-drops would cast my Mox Opal every single time, so as soon as I could cast a couple more artifacts, it would ramp me.
I feel like in that cube, my question is not like, what is the theme of your deck or what's your archetype? I'm like, what is your amount of spells?
Yeah.
Like that to me honestly describes the archetype of a deck so much better because it's like a companion almost. Like you get this every game. Yeah. If you want it, and so saying Mox Opal's your companion is like, yeah, that means that your deck is an affinity deck.
Right. I saw somebody else playing that had both the Demonic Tutor with Suspend and the Soul Ring with Suspend, which are 2 of I think the most powerful cards in the cube, and it's just like, yeah, every game starts with them playing a 1-drop that either gets them a Demonic Tutor or a Soul Ring.
And they'll be like, I wanted the other one.
You know it. And I actually had, because I was trying to do this affinity thing, I had both Ornithopter and Mox Opal in the deck initially, and Zach gave me a little bit of deck advice, and he's like, look, you just want to have the Mox every time. Like, don't waste your time with this Ornithopter.
Yeah, unfortunately, my beloved Ornithopter is probably not at its best there.
And the cards that really carried me were things like Nettlecyst and Urza and Kappa Cannoneer. It was a little bit funny. I also had Force of Will, which is, I think, one of the most powerful cards in the cube because, it's like, because it's the first spell on each turn, being able to cast something on your turn, Cascade, and then cast an instant on your opponent's turn. You get another Cascade, plus obviously you're cheating with Force of Will, so you get maybe a 4-drop off of it. I never drew Force of Will, and I cascaded into it, I think, 3 times, so it ended up just being horrible in my deck.
Dang. Yeah, I guess if you have like Kappa Cannoneer and a bunch of big affinity spells, You're going to cascade into 5-drops. It's funny, I was going to ask you how you played with it because I've had Force of Will in my deck before, and I often wonder, like, do I just force the first thing if it's in my opening hand, regardless of what it is? Like,
I think so. Just for the potential for I get Urza on turn 1?
Yeah, that is a high upside, but also, you're giving up your free interaction that you could also hold up all game until it really mattered. And I didn't know what to do. And maybe Zach will write in and tell us.
I mean, there were games where I just cast the, what's the Delve removal spell?
Murderous Cut?
I just cast my Murderous Cut on like a 1/1 at the end of their turn because I'm just like, I don't really have anything else going on in my hand. I just want to cascade into something for more value right here.
Yeah, Murderous Cut, a lot worse than Force of Will, I think we can agree.
That's fair. So I ended up winning the first match of this, and then the second match was really, really close. I had an incredibly commanding lead. I had a Kappa Cannoneer that I was so close. I was like a few points away from killing my opponent in one shot, who was at, I think, 23 or 24 life. I couldn't quite figure out how to get them there, and then, I stayed up all in the back of my brain all night was like, oh, did you miss that you could have sequenced it this way? Because I had both Nettlecyst and Cranial Plating in play at that time, so could I have gotten...
one-shot your opponent at that point.
I could have done 19
with Cannoneer,
which is unblockable. It was crazy, but I ended up attacking their Planeswalker that would have been able to kill my Cannoneer next turn because I couldn't one-shot them because I was confident I would be able to the next turn, and then they did 15 damage to me.
Well, you said you could just do 19, so I don't think anybody has any sympathy for you.
Well, except I was at 15, so I lost that match. So I lost the second match, and we didn't end up playing a third, but I felt like I understood the assignment this time playing the Cascade Cube.
Did you feel like it broke your brain? Was there smoke coming out of your ears?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so you understood the assignment, but still took a lot of...
psychic damage.
a lot of psychic damage in the process.
Yeah. So then Saturday morning, if you've listened to the podcast, you'll know my strategy for these events has been pretty consistent. You're able to, with Hedron Network, the software you use, both rank cubes you want to play and exclude cubes you don't want to play specifically. So I just ranked my cube and your cube, which was in the event, as things I didn't want to play because I've played those enough. And otherwise went full random. And I got put into Tyler's Jund Cube, which is a really fun cube. It's obviously Jund. Everything is green, red, or black. I've actually had the chance to play it when he brought it to Baltimore, maybe, 3 years ago, something like that?
Well, no, it was like last year, I think.
No.
Yeah, I think so.
Really?
I think it was like last summer.
Usually I feel like time feels the opposite.
I was going to ask if you were in that pod, because I do remember drafting it.
I was, and there I also think I didn't have much success, but I did a lot better and ended up 3-0ing this first draft.
And then this is why you did so well, because then the pin's out of the way. Now the pressure's off. Now you get to just play easy all weekend.
I find the Jund Cube to be actually very difficult to draft because I kind of went into it with the mentality that I'm just going to be playing all colors. I'm just going to take fixing pretty highly, and I'm not going to worry too much about just being in a 2-color deck. I know I'm at least going to be splashing the 3rd color, so anything's on the table. And that makes it very difficult because I feel like you can't necessarily use a lot of heuristics to exclude stuff from your deck. You can't just be like, oh yeah, I'm drafting blue-white, I can ignore all these red cards in the pack. I felt like I really had to try and parse and process everything in every single pack. And I can't claim to have done that, but I guess I did it well enough. My deck was pretty low curving. I had a bunch of cheap 2-drops. I had Inti and Party Thrasher, which ended up doing a lot of work. Glissa Sunslayer, which is a first strike death touch that when it hits your opponent gives you a menu of options, was very powerful. And the thing that really stood out was Indatha Raptor, the perfect hybrid. I think this was actually my first pick.
I remember Tyler posting a pack 1 pick 1 of the Jun Cube, and it included the Jun Triome, whatever that one's called. And I was like, I can't believe I'm passing the Jun Triome and the Jun Cube, but this Raptor is broken.
It's insane. It's like it has Bloodthirst, and it gets X counters equal to the amount of damage you've dealt, and then it has Menace, and then if it's dealt damage, it does something heinous
and
to your opponent.
It's like a 2-drop, right?
3-drop.
3-drop, okay.
So I just would like cast this on turn 3, and it's a 5/3 with Menace and tremendous upside. It was very nuts. My weakness here was definitely my mana base because I was in that same situation where I kept being like, okay, I just want to focus on the cards that are going to generate a bunch of value and the fixing. But I kept getting taken by the cards with a lot of value.
It is funny that your overview of this draft is, I assume I'm playing all colors. Mana will not be a problem.
Exactly.
My biggest problem was my mana.
That is exactly what happened.
So you were more aggressive then?
I was pretty aggressive, yeah. I mean, I was just trying to be on the offensive and using a lot of these cards that generate a lot of card selection to deal with my mana issues. The finals here was really interesting. I was playing against Max, friend of ours, who's actually the organizer of the Salt Box here in Baltimore, and it was such a close end of the draft where we were both at very low life totals. I had 1 card in hand, and he had Deathrite Shaman and Kroxa, so he could just attack me with Kroxa, force me to discard the card, and drain me for the last 2, but he would be dead on the crackback if I had a non-land to be able to discard. So I was sweating and chewing my nails, like, is he going to choose to attack me here and call my bluff for having a basic forest in my hand?
Was that what you had in your hand?
It is what I had in hand, and he chose not to attack, and then I had to figure out, well, I'm definitely losing next turn because, you know, he can just double drain me with the Deathrite Shaman and find another damage somewhere. And then I flipped a card with Caustic Bronco, which was a 5-drop to kill him. Perfect. Maybe perfect is a stretch. It was a little sloppy and complicated, and I think Max could have seen through my poker face if he thought about it a little bit longer, but I was happy to get the win.
Now, be honest, were you holding that land because you foresaw this exact situation coming up, and you were like, I want to keep cards in hand to have the plausible deniability that I might discard it on land, and therefore make Kroxa only hit for 6 instead of 9?
Yeah, I mean, and I had Glissa in play, so Kroxa was not going to hit me. So it was just about, was the discard going to kill me? And it's guaranteed. If you have an empty hand, it's guaranteed to do that damage. So that was definitely a factor.
That seems like a rewarding sequence, especially if it was like coming a couple turns away, and you were like, I'm just not going to play this land because... Like, if you're holding it for some other reason, like I might draw a, throw possibility, then...
I also did have Inti and Party Crasher. Like, there was lots of reasons that I wanted to keep extra cards in my hands, for sure.
Okay.
I also just had some crazy sequences with this deck. Do you know the card Honest Rutstein?
I definitely have seen the art. I know it's a 3-drop. I know it's Golgari, and I think it's like... Get to do like one of 4 things a turn based on...
That's old Rutstein.
Okay, I don't...
The honest Rutstein, it's a Gravedigger, but you give it 1 more power, take off 1 mana, and also all your creature spells cost 1 less. So I had, for example, a crazy sequence where I cast this, get a creature back from my graveyard, then cast a Burning Tree Emissary, and then 2 more 2-drops that each cost 1 less. So it's just like, oh yeah, I'm just going to get 9 mana worth of spells for 5 mana.
What was your next draft of the weekend?
The next draft, I got put into Maze Fae Cube. So this is a sort of thematic cube with a lot of fairies and classical high fantasy things. If you want to hear May talk about this, she's done a great sort of rundown on the Uber Cube podcast.
Linked in the show notes.
I've drafted this once before as well in a CubeCon in a past year, where I drafted sort of the classic blue-black fairies with Una, which was a really grindy deck that I had fun with, but didn't do great with. Here I ended up drafting green-white elves and wolves, which is kind of a weird tribal synergy thing, but it turns out...
Tolsimir says no.
Tulsa, exactly.
Wait, is he
Great
an elf
point.
or a human?
He's an elf.
Okay, there you go.
And he's a friend of the wolves.
Tulsamere says no.
So sort of following what I had heard May talk about this cube is that the shapeshifters are really, really important. And so I sort of wanted to test that theory. And while I was focusing on wolves and elves, I took that any changelings that I saw pretty highly because they were obviously going to bridge both of those and then take tribal payoffs. So things that would just reward you for having specific creature types. So that includes some things like Conjurer's Mantle, that whenever you attack with a creature, you get to look at the top 6 cards of your library and get one for free that shares a type, which if you put that on a shapeshifter, you just get anything. But also, it turned out if you just put it on anything and you have enough shapeshifters in your deck, you're just always going to draw some creature. The first time I did this, my opponent was like, okay, well, do you want to see if you have any more bunnies in your deck? Because I happened, one of my few off type creatures was a bunny. And I was like, yeah, I guess I have to do this. It's not a man. I was like, oh yeah, here's a shapeshifter. Of course I have more bunnies in my deck. And it was like, yeah,
got more of everything in my deck.
I also had Raised by Wolves, which makes one of your creatures huge based on the number of wolves you have. Ren's Run's Packmaster was really, really important for most of my drafts. This is a thing that you have to pay the additional cost of championing one of your elves, so you have to exile it for as long as this...
Could be an upside.
Could be an upside. It never was. But then this just says 3 mana, make a wolf, and all your wolves have Death Touch. So I just had a number of games where I just played this on turn 3 and then spammed out wolves for the rest of the game, which isn't necessarily the most riveting gameplay, but honestly I had a good time doing it. And then Mirror Entity was another big standout in my draft of just, it turns everything into a shapeshifter and potentially makes your board really, really big, so it's got huge potential for threat of activation and turned on all those little tribal things all at once for all of your creatures. I played in round 1 Parker, who, not our Parker, but a different Parker, who was playing sort of a goblin deck, and that was not a particularly close match, but we had a good time. Played Roja.
I assume you won,
and
based
I did
on the
win.
way you said that. If you lost, you'd be going into a lot more detail. Sounds like...
Ren's Run Packmaster really kind of stole the show and took over some games. I played against Roja round 2 and also managed to 2-0 that match, also playing goblins, and there were some close moments, but... I mean, my deck, I was a little bit unsure how it would do just looking at the list, because I was particularly light on interaction was my biggest hole, but I was just so consistently able to get pressure on early and keep pressure on early that really wasn't an issue. Like, I didn't feel the need for having a bunch of removal.
Aggro decks don't need as much removal.
Right, which, I mean, that really made me think of, I think Justin Parnell said this about, I think maybe you were having a conversation with him about one of his decks at some point, and you were asking about why doesn't he need more removal here, and he's like, well, it's great if you can answer any question, but I kind of want to be the person asking the questions in this matchup.
Right.
And that's really what I was feeling, was like I was the person asking the questions in these matches. So then going into the championship for this, I played against Ian Braverman, who he's been doing a podcast called Cube Reviews you should check out. He is a known Bant Blink enjoyer. And true enough, he drafted Blue-White Blink in this cube. His deck was pretty cool. He managed to one game sort of get his engine set up and overwhelm me. But in the other 2 games, I, again, was just able to get fast enough on the table and just overwhelm him. And to the point where he was, chump blocking with his engine pieces, which
that's where he wanted
forced
to be.
him to not, be able to actually set it up. I had one game in particular that was just crazy. It just felt like it was not from this cube, where I played an Arbor Elf and then a ramp enchantment on one of my lands, and then turn 3 played Tulsamere, Friend to the Wolves, which I was honestly surprised to see this in the cube because it seems a little bit overpowered, but it's obviously super flavorful.
Yeah, I mean,
and fits in with all the themes.
Gotta choose your power outliers.
But, turn 3 play Tulsamere, destroy the one creature you've played, and then turn 4 played one spell, Combat Trick to pump my Arbor Elf, and then one spell that pumped my wolves, one spell that pumped my elves, and just was attacking with
you had so many combat tricks.
3 4/4s. It was kind of nuts.
You say you didn't have removal, but your removal was just combat tricks, it sounds like.
It wasn't
unless they were not
combat
instant
trick.
speed.
It was a
sorceries.
sorcery. It was, I think, the Pollen Shield Hair, which both is an adventure that gives your creature +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control, if I'm remembering correctly, and then also gives your creature tokens +1/+1. So I both wanted to play the adventure and then play the creature so that all of my things would not trade in combat. Crazy sequence. I mean, it was just a blast to pilot this deck, especially the shapeshifter stuff was a lot of fun.
So you started on 2 3-0s.
2 3-0s. There was
playing so well, Maddox.
a third draft to this day, but I was tired and hungry. We went out.
He does it again.
Had a
Anthony
couple beers,
Maddox.
had a delicious hamburger, and had a nice night, and went to bed pretty early.
But I mean, I imagine if you perform well the first draft the next day, you're probably still in top 8 contention having 2 3-0s under your belt.
Yeah, so it ended up being very close. So my third draft of the main event, I was put into Eiganjo Drift, which is Judge Bones' vehicle cube, which it's a vehicle cube, and the twist is everybody starts with a mech hanger in play, which is a land that both taps for mana of any color for pilots and vehicles, and also lets you basically turn a vehicle into a creature for 3 mana and tapping it. This cube, again, I'd played once before at Steel City Cube, and I 3-0'd that as well. So this is the first cube that I had previously had very much success with. I ended up drafting a not super focused deck, which was just kind of an Esper vehicle deck. I was looking for especially vehicles that generated their own pilots, because I think this is where you can like pretty easily lose games kind of just from having the wrong balance of pilots versus vehicles here and ending up getting stuck with a bunch of vehicles, and your opponent has just the right removal spells to make them not function. So I was also looking for, ways to recur my creatures. Recommission was a really critical piece for this. Night Scythe, speaking of vehicles that can crew themselves.
Boy, Universes Beyond cards. They're good.
Reckoner Bankbuster, a good way to sort of recoup and regenerate card advantage. And also I had Lita, Mechanical Engineer, which I was really excited about. This is just kind of a nonsense card that spits out 5/5 vehicles, but unfortunately I never drew it. I had kind of a realization halfway through this. There's kind of a few level up moments. Because you start with that mech hanger, any off-color vehicle and pilot that you play is obviously a free splash. And that is honestly pretty difficult to be flipping through all the cards in your deck as you're drafting, and just keep that in mind to try and figure out what lane you're in, and to sort of detrain yourself to be like, oh yeah, here's a vehicle that costs 2 and a red. Even though I have no red cards, I can just take that and it's fine.
Mm-hmm. You could detrain yourself or deplane yourself or decar yourself.
Yourself. Oh, I forgot about all the great vehicle puns I had thought about in the shower this morning. Anyway, I was worried that my draft was going to be kind of a train wreck, but it turned out the real risk was whether or not I'd be able to pilot it correctly. I remembered them. The other sort of level up moment that I feel like I kind of thought of too late in the draft to really take advantage of, but the mech hanger also does have that 3 mana ability to just turn a vehicle on. So there's lots of vehicles that I looked at that are just like, oh yeah, this is cool, but it has crew 6. Like, that's never going to happen unless I have the giant ox or whatever. But actually just having always the option to be able to turn it on makes them pretty powerful. I mean, I was even looking at the Colossal Plow, which is kind of a joke card from the set that works with the Giant Ox. It has crew 6, but when it attacks, you get 3 life and get 3 mana, which means if you're using that ability of the mech hanger, it almost just pays itself back, and you're just attacking with a pretty reasonable threat pretty early. So I did end up being like, oh yeah, Colossal Plow is actually just a fine card here, and some other things that have big crew costs, I'm a little bit more willing to include them, but I think I had that realization a little bit too late to take great advantage of it.
So how'd this one turn out for you?
Not so well. Here's where our hero falls.
It's good. It's good to remind yourself you still have weaknesses,
It's true. So I played round 1 against Alden. We had a good match, but they had a little bit of difficult mana issues, and also just, drawing the wrong combination, again, of like vehicles and ways to crew them. He was doing a dwarf tribal a little bit, and there were a couple interesting payoffs.
Yeah.
And I like that about this cube, that it's largely about vehicles, but there are a couple other little themes that you can sew in here. So even though my deck wasn't super focused, it was cool to see other people doing some more focused thematic decks. What ended up being a really defining card in this matchup was Comball, Console of Allocation, or as Bones would call it, the DMV, which
that makes sense.
When so many of the cards are vehicles or other kinds of artifacts, it ends up just taxing people a lot and draining people for a lot of life. And again, here's a recommission. Just being able to buy this back multiple times was really, really valuable.
I've been really enjoying casting Recommission in other cubes, and I put it in my own Sacred Geometry cube, and I'm excited about it. It's nice. The +1/+1 counter makes it worth the 2 mana over a 1 mana unearth.
It really
makes a
does.
big difference.
Especially playing against an opponent with mostly red burn spells. It's like, oh yeah, not only am I going to be able to get this back and it's a critical piece, it's now going to be out of bolt range. So round 2, I played against Dan. Dan's deck was incredible, and I also drew very badly. I mulliganed just a very slow hand, so by the time I was casting meaningful things, he had plenty of answers for it, so he steamrolled me pretty easily. Round 3, I played against Lincoln, and I did manage to win that game. We had some interesting back and forth. So finished my third draft of the event 2-1, which put me at, I think, rank 14, so just missing that top 8. I think if I had played one more round in that draft that I skipped and gotten at least one win, I would have been in the top 8, which is okay. I was there to have fun and play games, and the top 8 would have been fairly stressful. And
once again, you got to ramen instead of stress.
Exactly.
Or whatever you ate. Not ramen, I think.
It was a hamburger. And then I did do one more draft while the top 8 was going. There was another round of drafts that you could jump into. I ended up in the Dungeoneers Cube, which was designed by Parker, who I played round 1 of the Fake Cube. I think I was maybe a little bit tired at this point, and the cube is maybe a little bit new. It has a couple features that I think were a little bit challenging for me, and honestly, I think it's mostly just about coming into it with the right expectations. There was some tribal themes that I couldn't quite get a bearing on. There was a pretty broad power level disparity, which is potentially very fun, but also it felt like some of my matches were very much about just who had more bombs versus who had enough removal. And I especially had some games where just my removal was not functional against my opponent's bombs. So this wasn't my most fun draft, but they're not all going to be.
You had a
winners.
lot of highs. You get to have a couple lows too.
It's true.
The highs only taste so good because of those deep dark
I want to
lows.
ask you one thing, because this is maybe where I started to feel a little sour. Is, do you notice anything that's wrong with this dragon that I'm showing you right now?
Voracious Fell Beast.
Yeah.
6 mana, 4/4 creature dragon beast. Voracious Fell Beast enters the battlefield. Each opponent sacrifices a creature. Create a food token for each creature sacrificed this way. It's not a dragon.
Exactly. It's incredible that you actually read Dragon Beast, even though it's
Drake
not
Beast.
a dragon.
Did I say Dragon
You said
Beast?
Dragon.
Well,
I had this card, Rivaz of the Claw, which taps for 2 mana for your dragons, and I was like, okay, this is cool. I'm kind of like, my draft is going a little bit wonky. I'm trying to play too many colors, but I'm going to cast these couple dragons with this guy, and it's going to be a good time. I have my opening hand. I'm like, cool, we got Rivaz, we've got a big dragon that's got an edict attached to it. I have another removal spell and something else relevant. This is going to be a great opening hand. I go to cast Voracious Fell Beast and read the type line as I'm about to show to my opponent and realize this is not a dragon. I can't do this, and my hand is non-functional.
yeah. I've been thinking about, I think you and I have maybe noted a bunch, and some people have bemoaned that it seems like there are more cards that have this kind of lack of resonance or inelegance to them, where it's things just don't work the way you think they should, or they're overly complicated. And part of that might be that R&D's changed a little bit. I also kind of had the realization today. I was watching Ristic Studies' latest video on ambiguity in card design, and I just kind of thought well, they're just making so many more of them. Even if the percentage of cards that aren't quite resonant or work in funky ways or don't do what you expect them to do, if the percentage hasn't gone up, there's still gonna be way more individual cards like that just because there's so many more cards printed.
That's true. I mean, when it comes to this particular card, as of course somebody near me was able to explain, because of the Lord of the Rings storyline, this wasn't a dragon because there's only one dragon, which is Smaug or whatever. Sorry if I'm getting that wrong. I don't care. But yeah, I mean, that was a little bit of a funny moment where, I mean, I'm used to checking, is this pirate a human, or is it actually a merfolk, or is this a cleric versus a whatever other kind of class? But dragons are such an iconic creature type. It's not something I'm used to double checking. So yeah, this was a little bit of a difficult draft, but still had some fun moments, and curious to see where this cube goes in the future.
A successful weekend of Magic.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to the next one. We're going to be doing Boston Cube Party and the Salt Box in the next couple weeks.
Well,
months.
I
Months.
was about to say, don't
the big weeks.
the really big ones. Well, I didn't get to go to Vertex, as I mentioned, sick dog and all. She's fine, everybody, but just didn't want to leave a sick dog with our would-be dog sitter. Didn't want the dog to have to leave her house either, and then have to it was just complicated. So I came back to take care of the dog.
But before Vertex, you were at another event up in New York.
Yeah, and so I signed up for Vertex, bought my ticket, and then was invited to come participate in this fundraiser for Tabletop Workers United. Listeners of the podcast will have heard my little intro before episode with Carmen where I explained the event. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you popped in and saw the stream last Thursday, maybe gave a little money. Otherwise, you can check out the video, which I'll put in the show notes. I don't know what YouTube channel it's going to end up being on. It might be ours, might be somebody else's, but I'll put the link in the show notes to that video, and that GoFundMe is still up, so you don't have to... You can donate still. You don't have to donate just when the live stream is happening. This was a filmed event that was organized by a committee of people that are working with the Tabletop Workers United to basically build solidarity and help them get the word out and, do labor organizing. And I got to go to the offices of Workers United, which is the parent union that Tabletop Workers United is part of. And this is a union that has done a bunch of organizing in New York City. They've organized the bunch of service workers in different industries in New York City. I believe they were a big part of the Amazon strike that was happening in New York. They got a nice office in Manhattan on the 7th floor of a nice building. It's really cool. And they wanted to draft 100 Ornithopters, which I thought is cool. I'm into it. We also even kind of made it a little bit of a tie-in to the theme a little bit, like, 100 individual Ornithopters can't accomplish anything on their own, but if you organize them, blah, blah, blah. It's a little cheesy, but whatever.
I think that's pretty resonant. I'm into that.
I thought so too. So anyway, I'm working on making some promotional materials for the event and communicating in this Discord with all these people that are all volunteering their time to make this thing happen. There's a couple people that are employees of the union, but they're not like dedicated Magic or Cube people, so they're like helping with logistics. But the people putting in all the work on this basically are volunteers. They're just doing this to help the union raise some money for their strike fund. So I don't really get nervous to have my cube drafted anymore because I've been to many events. I have a much more sort of easygoing attitude with the idea of cards being overpowered or underpowered, but I was definitely thinking about the cube going into this draft because this cube was on coverage at CubeCon last year, and I mean, for those that don't know, this cube is a cube where the only creatures over 100 copies of the card Ornithopter, which means that your deck has to be some sort of synergistic engine that will turn Ornithopters into threats in some way or another, and as a result, the games can be kind of swingy. I also include a lot of powerful cards. Sometimes you can go turn 1 for Ornithopters, Gaia's Cradle, Door of Destinies, and sometimes you can just play land and pass. There's a wide variety of what the decks are capable of here. So I was a little nervous going in, and the games that ended up on coverage at CubeCon, I would say, were definitely not the best games this cube is capable of producing. There were a lot of sort of one-sided blowout sort of games and some silliness, which I think was actually fine in the context of that stream because it was a long weekend of, various types of Magic, most of which were pretty serious, and so to have a little bit of silliness in there was totally welcome. But this is just one draft that's being filmed, and we filmed it a week ahead of time, and the footage is currently being edited now, and then what's going to happen on the live stream is they're going to show that footage with live commentary. So the commentators can talk to chat, and the commentators are Aspiring Spike and also Jessie Robkin, aka Titty Pills, who was in the draft of the event herself. So she has firsthand experience.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense because people participating in the chat wouldn't be able to influence the games anyway. You're just interacting with the commentators.
Yeah, it also means that, it makes it much easier to make a better finished product.
Absolutely.
Because they have time to edit it. They're, making the video a lot nicer than it would be able to be live because it's so much work to do live coverage of, a draft and feature matches and stuff. It also meant there was way less pressure on us filming. We could take breaks and, take things a little bit easier.
For sure. So you were nervous or a little bit apprehensive, not because you thought gameplay would be bad, but or there's very specific expectations about a stream event versus just having a group of people play and have a good time.
Yeah, I mean, I was more concerned about it being an entertaining consumer product at the end, right? Which is never my goal as a cube designer. My goal as a cube designer is to make a fun gameplay experience.
Right.
And part of what the 100 Ornithopters Cube allows for is room for some nonsense to happen. And nonsense might be fun and interesting as a player. Maybe you get a fun story to tell. I'm thinking of the time that Ollie went turn 1, 6 Ornithopters, convoke Obelisk Averd. That's a cool story to tell. Is that super fun to watch when that game ends in 2 turns? Because your opponent didn't have a disenchant? Probably not.
It's kind of cool.
At least was my thesis. So anyway, I'm really excited about the event and excited to meet all these new people. And nobody really working on it is anybody I've ever really known before. A couple of folks that I have run into at Cube events in the past and had a brief 2-minute conversation with, or maybe some people that I've followed on social media for a while, but I'm not close to any of these people. Or I should say I wasn't until we did this event. Now I feel like I'm close to a lot of them. Anyway, going in, I did not want to be a drafter because of a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to be around to help, run the event, make sure things ran smoothly, hand people tokens when they need them, and just make sure everything sort of worked. And I also kind of felt like everyone else drafting the cube has never played the cube before, and being the cube designer, I have a little bit of an advantage. I know all the cards. I don't have to read them when we do the draft, right? I have definitely some kind of leg up going in terms of knowing the power outliers and, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think very often, and we've talked about this before, how being the designer of a cube, when you're operating in more normal Magic space, doesn't necessarily give you as much of an advantage as you might think, because other players are also good at playing Magic, and you might also be bogged down by the things that you have sort of intended to be powerful or intended to come together, whereas other players might just have a fresher perspective.
Sure.
But I think for a cube like this that is extremely novel, your experience is going to give you a major leg up because you have a lot more heuristics built up that you're not going to be able to notice the first time playing it.
Yeah, and I also don't think it's particularly fun if I am in the draft and do well to have the cube designer win the whole thing. That seems kind of silly. So that was another reason I wanted to be excluded. The third reason was because I'm just not a great player, and there were really good players they invited for this draft. They went out of their way to get some popular streamers, some people that have been on the Pro Tour, people that have been, competitive on the SCG circuit, just really good Magic players that are also affiliated with the sort of New York Magic scene or the Union in some way, and I'm not. So I'm like, great, get people in here that can play this cube, and I won't draft it. And what they ended up doing was making me the alternate. Like, if somebody can't draft, then we have you to fall back on, which I thought was a great solution. It also solves the problem of what happens if somebody gets sick or whatever. And as it turned out, one of the drafters was just had a long week and didn't want to draft, which, all respect to that. So I did end up being in the draft. I did something before the draft, which I feel like some cube designers would think is like normal, that I actually have always avoided, which is I actually prepared a little slideshow on the train up to give to all the drafters to say, like, hey, we're here.
My academic thesis on the cube.
We're here to hopefully make an entertaining product to be viewed. Let me just run you down some of the like key cards of this cube, some of the pitfalls I've seen new drafters falling into, just like say some of the stuff that is like obvious after your first draft, so that hopefully you go into this not making those obvious mistakes, and we have as minimum number of games where decks just don't work as possible.
Right. So this is very different from a normal draft where your players would not participate in this much preamble, but you have kind of a captive audience of people that are, willing to coordinate on presenting a good show.
It's not even that. Even if the players would participate, and I think a lot of players would, like some players really like to do their homework or are happy to have a longer cube speech. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't think most players are. I think if you're listening to this podcast, you probably are willing to give a longer cube speech than most players are willing to listen to.
I can say firsthand that, yes, I will give too long of a cube speech.
That's not even what I'm talking about, though. What I'm talking about is I, as the designer, do not want to influence people playing my cube for the first time. I don't want to, change their opinion about something because I don't think I know it all, right? I definitely don't understand every in and out of the environment, and I want people to draft things I don't expect and, rate cards differently than I rate them and, go through the draft and just have a novel experience where they get to approach it with their fresh. That's the beauty of a cube draft to me, is that it's all of my perspective on the game is the cube itself, and that's sort of brought to the table there, and all of the players' perspective of the game is brought to the table and how they play it. I don't want my perspective to also be polluting how they play it. And then it's just I'm talking to myself. There's no reason to do that. So I would never do that in a regular draft. And I thought about it a lot. I asked the players, hey, I would never normally do this. Is this something you want me to do, though? Do people think this would be useful? Everyone thought it'd be useful. So I did do that. So I gave a little presentation. It went fine. I was like, don't pass R shards. Don't pass the Echoing Boon. Make sure your deck has card advantage. And make sure you don't lose to a single duress or counterspell or disenchant. I ran down.
Did you mention Glimpse of Nature?
Glimpse of Nature.
Great, okay.
I actually had kind of fun on the train, just very haphazardly composing slides where the rough size of the card was how important it was. So I was like, here's card advantage. Here's a really big glimpse of nature.
It's 2025. We're back to tag clouds.
It's basically a tag cloud. I was like, card advantage is important. Here's a really big glimpse of nature, and here's a slightly smaller Rite of Harmony, and a slightly smaller Galvanic Relay, and an even smaller, Echoing Return or whatever.
How big was Ornithopter on this slide?
There was no Ornithopters on any of the slides.
Because that's the big question: is how important is it to take?
There was an Ornithopter on the first slide, and it was... I didn't really inform pick order. I didn't want to get that detailed. I was just people did ask, when should you take Ornithopters? And I was like, everyone has different approaches. I couldn't tell you one approach is right or wrong. I did on the first slide point out that the Ornithopters do have a type line, which my printing doesn't, which is still the biggest mistake I ever made with this cube. Very stupid.
I mean, you're weighing a lot of factors, and I think you did the best you could.
Well, I didn't, because there is a printing with the exact same art with the type line.
Oh, you messed up.
So I messed up.
You messed up so bad.
Yeah, messed up real bad. And at the time, I wasn't even thinking about that when I bought that version. I was like, oh, this is the first printing of that art. It's the mirrored printing of Ornithopter was the first time it was reprinted in the modern era, which is kind of fun. And also, I think I slightly preferred the flavor text or something stupid to the 10th edition one that has the type line. Anyway, that's a mistake I made. I pointed that out, and I also pointed out a couple other logistical things. Anyway, I did this. We get in the draft, and because I'm not a known player and because of all of my other reasons to not participate in the draft, they did seed the pod such that I would not be on stream unless I made it to the finals. They made me as far from being on stream as possible, which is, I think, a reasonable thing to do. But it's what I would have asked them to do if they had approached me, but they didn't. They just put me there naturally. I drafted what Bones, friend of the show, calls the Disenchantress deck. Though actually, I'm not sure if he would still count as Disenchantress because I didn't have Enchantress's presence. But I was playing a Disenchant control deck in Abzan, and the cards that were the key sort of premier cards in my deck is I recently added Vraska Gargari Queen, which is I think really strong here. That was a premier card. I had Viridian Revel, which every time an opponent's artifact dies, you get to draw a card optionally, which is a really potentially potent source of card advantage, especially when you're playing a lot of disenchants. You can just turn them all into cantrips, which is really cool. And then I just kind of filled out the deck with just like good stuff and a couple of like incidental win conditions. I had probably 6 cards that could win the game, so it wasn't like I was dead to a single duress, but none of my win conditions were fast. It was like, I'm going to answer your whole board, and then I'm going to kill you with Gavany Township, or I'm going to kill you with Innkeeper's Talent. Like, I'm just going to kind of grind you to death. Oh, the other card that was really huge here was Bow of Nylea. It's one of those legendary artifacts. It's got 4 modes. The modes are 2 damage to target flyer, which kills any unmodified Ornithopter, gain 3 life, put 4 cards from your graveyard on the bottom of your library, or put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, which was just an awesome control card in this context. Being able to hold that mana up and either remove an Ornithopter if they hadn't modified it 1 a turn to sort of chip away at them, or put counters on my own Ornithopters slowly to make them sort of amenable win conditions, and also to kind of guarantee I'm never going to deck myself if it comes to that. Like, just a really sort of solid role player at a lot of different spots in the curve.
Is that a recent addition?
Recenter, but not super recent.
Okay. Seems good.
It was not there before CubeCon, I don't believe.
It also gives your attacking creatures Death Touch, which seems kind of like throwaway text, but so often, like, an Ornithopter blocking a 1/3 Ornithopter happens.
Yeah, no, it really matters. So the card's really strong, I think. So round 1, I had a close match with an aggressive Naya deck, but I think this is a deck that my deck is kind of built to prey on, because you can just kind of pick apart their specific pieces and grind them out with card advantage. I did lose a game, and it wasn't because I like mulled to 4 or whatever. I just lost because my opponent had a great curve, so not a matchup I'm always going to win, but I did win that one. Second round, I played against a very cool combo deck that I've never seen anybody draft before in this cube that used Wheel of Sun and Moon as a combo piece. They basically aimed to get their deck completely empty, which they did with a combination of Skull Clamp and Phyrexian Altar, as well as 2 different ways to play Ornithopters off the top of your library. They had both Elven Chorus and Mystic Forge, and were able in their other matches to pretty consistently draw their entire deck, play Wheel of Sun and Moon, and then just turn any one of their Ornithopters, because they have a way to play one off the top of their library, into infinite sack outlets for whatever they wanted. So they gained infinite life in one match because they had Forsaken Monument out. They made infinite mana with Phyrexian Altar, Infinite Storm. Just a really cool combo deck, which, you know, a couple duresses and disenchants really took a big bite out of, and they also drew kind of poorly. So I win the second round, so I'm in the finals, which is not where I want to be for all the reasons aforementioned. And the other reason I don't want to be in the finals, frankly, is that I don't want to be on coverage making a bunch of punts, because I expect that I'm going to do this. I expect that I'm going to make mistakes on coverage and be embarrassed, and so I just don't really want to be there. But there I am. I'm playing against Jesse in the third round. Jesse, who's, I think, become a good friend. And Jesse's playing a really sick Grixis combo sacrifice deck, splashing for Bloodbond March. I will say, too, a brief side note, from this draft specifically, observing how the Triomes got used makes me feel so vindicated in playing them in this cube, because it got used exactly how I wanted them to get used, which is to say this Grixis deck was able to trivially splash green for Bloodbond March, which was just cool. Like, it's not soupy good stuff. You just took whatever cards you wanted. It just meant that you could build a more novel combo engine, which was super awesome. And there was one other deck that did similar things, using Triomes to splash for like cool edge case combo pieces. And her deck was really sick. Game 1, I have a really strong draw. We both keep 7, I believe. And I have a turn 2 Seal of Cleansing. And Jesse kind of goes like, ugh, I don't think I can beat a Seal of Cleansing. Like, what am I supposed to do about that? Because all of their sort of combo pieces are enchantments, basically. That's how all these decks work. She's got Goblin Bombardment. She's got No Rest for the Wicked. She's got Fallen Ideal. She's got Meathook Massacre. Just all these things that are like part of these combo pieces that I can kind of pick apart with the Seal of Cleansing. Seal Primordium, actually. Not that it matters. They're the same card functionally. And I followed it up with Bow of Nylea and followed that up with Vraska and was just like cruising. Now, I will say that I didn't draw my Ornithopters this game. I had 9 in my deck. Jessie had 10 in her combo deck. And I honestly would have played probably a couple fewer if I had had even more disenchants, because, again, I'm not trying to like be aggressive. I'm just trying to win eventually. And so I'm happy to just turn my Ornithopters very slowly into win conditions. But I didn't draw like any for the longest time. And by the time I did, Jesse just removed my Innkeeper's Talent and just kept me from winning the game. It really dragged the game out, even though I had what seemed like such a firm, advantageous state. I also landed Viridian Revel at some point in this game and just drew a ton of cards, so I had card advantage on her too. It was just like, I felt like my deck was ticking on all cylinders. And then,
I mean, is this upside if you're worried about the game where somebody just says like, here's 6 Ornithopters and a Obelisk? Like, this is the opposite.
Oh, I should say too, so up to this point, all the coverage matches have been awesome. They've been so great. And I didn't like see the ones in the first round because I was playing, but I heard from, the people watching that they were really interesting, and so I heard some of the combos that happened. Like someone went off with Paradox Engine and Quicksilver Dagger, which my whole heart was just bursting. I was so happy about that. All the coverage games have been so great, so I'm like feeling really good. And this game is also great, which I end up losing. Jesse ends up like in one turn just presenting enough potential combo routes that, looking back at it, I don't think Seal of Primordium saves me. I didn't know where to use it, and I don't think I used it in the right place, but I think even using it in the right place, I'm still dead because they basically like presented all of their threats but Goblin Bombardment. They had drawn most of their deck with a combination of Ad Nauseam and other stuff, so they had all their cards in their hand basically, and I couldn't figure out where to use this disenchant.
Ad Nauseam and other stuff.
They drew a bunch of their...
And draw spells ad nauseum.
Yeah. And I realized I did make one misplay, which is that I was using my mana on stuff, but stuff that didn't really matter on my turn because I didn't have anything else to do. I was just like, I'm sitting here behind my Seal of Cleansing and my Bow of Nylea, which I can like protect me. And then if, she plays something really problematic, I can down tick Vraska next turn to, get rid of it. Like I had a lot of sorcery speed answers, which is by design. I definitely have more sorcery speed answers in this cube because it allows combo decks to cobble together a turn where they can make things happen. And that's exactly what Jesse did. It was beautiful. In hindsight, what I should have done is just not spend my mana because I had Viridian Revel and I knew Jesse was playing a sacrifice deck. Any way in which Jesse would go off would involve her sacrificing a ton of artifacts, and I did have exactly Disenchant in my deck. And if I had kept mana up and assumed I would draw it through all of my Viridian Revel draws, I probably could have gotten there. But instead, I spent my mana on something. Who knows what? We can go watch.
Could she have just decked you with the...
Not when I have Bow in play.
Right.
And also, Viridian Revel is a May.
Okay, then
so it doesn't have a big downside. Anyway, I was like buzzing after that game because I don't think I made super obvious mistakes. The one I mentioned was like I probably should have just, but that seems like a next order kind
People
of like
aren't going
next
to
level
notice
thing.
because they're not going to be like, oh, obviously you have an instant speed removal spell in your deck.
I mean, well, yeah, exactly. What I'm embarrassed about is not like not seeing kind of cool lines like that. I mean, I'll be embarrassed if I just like misread cards and play them wrong and like do that kind of dumb shit. So I'm really excited after this game. I'm like, this is awesome. Like, if I lose this way, fantastic. My deck is also doing its thing. And again, I am so not invested in my own performance in this draft, like compared to the matches are cool and interesting. I just want the matches to be cool and interesting. Then below that, I want to like not make extremely obvious mistakes to embarrass myself. And then below that, I guess, sure, it'd be cool to win, maybe, but like it's not really on my mind.
It'd be cool to lose is right above it's cool to win.
So I go to my sideboard and I bring in 2 cards. I bring in Thraben Charm because it has the mode to exile an opponent's graveyard, which will do wonders against this graveyard matter sort of sacrifice synergy deck. And I bring in Deafening Silence, which is a card that I've added to this cube a while ago because someone suggested it for sort of the fair aggro decks. Like if you're just playing, one aura or, equipment a turn, like just punish those combo decks that are trying to go off and have a giant turn by playing Deafening Silence, which is a 1-mana white enchantment that says each player can't cast more than 1 non-creature spell per turn, which is kind of interesting because it doesn't turn off all your Ornithopter stuff. You can still play as many Ornithopters as you want. They're all creature spells, but you can only play 1 non-creature spell per turn. I bring this in as well, and I cut 2 cards that are just not good. I cut 2 cards that are like anti-aggro cards because Jessie is basically never attacking with her deck, pretty much ever. I'm on the play because I lost. I think I mull to 6 in this game. I immediately make an obvious pun, which is that on turn 1, I play Deafening Silence and then attempt to play Engineer Explosives for 0, which I can't do because I already played 1 non-creature spell this turn, which is embarrassing. And like the ruling for that, we noticed immediately, is just that doesn't happen. Like I don't like have to discard it or whatever, but it's just embarrassing to be like, I didn't do the thing. And I'm like getting in my head now, like, don't do that.
And I'm sure you could have just sequenced it the other way and it would have been fine. And so maybe that's
I could have. I actually intentionally sequenced it that way because I wanted the Engineer Explosives to resolve more, and I knew that Jessie had some interaction in her deck, and so.
So you're thinking, this will probably get countered, and then I can cast this.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
I totally get that, and I make those kinds of wires crossed brain mistakes all the time.
But so I just like, and now I'm kind of like, I'm like frazzled. I'm like in my head that I like made this dumb mistake. This game goes forward, and Deafening Silence proves to be a huge problem for Jessie's deck. And
based on what you just described about, she's trying to get past your removal suite by doing a bunch of stuff all in one turn, right?
Yes, and also she's a Grixis deck that has some stack interaction, but doesn't have any interaction for a resolved enchantment. Like, you just got that now. Cool, I got to figure out a way to win through it somehow, which is going to be hard because I do have a lot of sorcery speed interaction in my deck and just a bunch of ways to disrupt her plan. This game goes quite long, and Jessie eventually scoops because she just doesn't have enough enough cards left in her deck to actually win. I've just like answered enough things, and she just gives up. And it's not the most exciting game. I'm like, well, that was kind of a bummer. The Deafening Silence just kind of like shut the door completely. But that's part of Magic. That happens sometimes. I am kind of kicking myself a little bit for these stupid like mistakes, and I'm also sitting there thinking like, oh, I hope I didn't do the thing as a cube designer where I put like a card in my cube that just kind of negates the whole point of the cube and just is not fun and doesn't contribute to anything, but just kind of ruins the game.
You built the Ornithopter Cube and you put the card in that says no Ornithopters.
Well, it's funny because it doesn't, but there's so many emergent themes and archetypes that come from all the creatures being Ornithopters that this then does shut off. So I was kind of sitting there like, oh, I hope I didn't do this. And Jessie made a very, like, a not at all rude comment, but was just kind of like, that card
seems good.
She was like, does that need to be in the cube? like, what's the purpose of that? Like,
fair question.
In a very friendly way. Like, Jessie was not being rude about it at all. It was just kind of like, and we had friendly, conversation all day. So it was, well within our dynamic. It was just kind of like, oh, interesting. That's kind of devastating for me. So we're getting ready for game 3, and I'm like,
Do you side it out?
I had the thought. I was like, do I just side Deafening Silence out? Like, again, our goal here is just to make like good coverage games or whatever, and it seems like this is not going to contribute to fun games. But we are keeping track of the sideboards so that we can tell the commentators what we did, so they know going into the game. So if I pull it out, then it'll be somewhat obvious that I'm making this kind of like meta.
You can say, I don't want it when I'm on the draw, because it's only good on turn 1.
It would be obvious, I think, that the card that just won me the game single-handed, I take it out. It's me, like, essentially throwing a little bit, which I didn't want to be obvious on coverage. And even if we decided to, like, lie about it, if you consider the coverage that important and the, like, integrity of the game not at all important, I knew that Jessie, who's a very skilled competitive player, would not want me to, like, hamstring my deck to, like, be more fair against them. I knew that they're competitively minded. They want to win the game in the hardest sort of circumstances. So I leave it in. I don't change my sideboard. I keep the Thraben Charm, keep the Deafening Silence. In game 3, I mulled a 5, and it's a pretty bad 5. I believe it is 4 lands and Vraska, because I think I mulled a no lander and then a 6 lander and then had another 6 lander and put 2 lands on bottom and kept 4 and Vraska, which not doing anything until turn 4 is bad. I mean, Vraska's good, but not doing anything until then is quite bad. I drew pretty well. I drew non-lands and was able to interact earlier, and then I do eventually draw Deafening Silence and I play it. And the game kind of plays out the same way. It's really long. Jessie can only do one thing a turn, and I keep answering it. And Anthony, while I was doing this, I have never played worse Magic in my entire life, because at this point, I am so in my head about having made the mistakes in the previous game, having put this card in my cube that is maybe ruining the whole draft and maybe ruining the finals of this thing that everyone's worked so hard on, that I'm just not upticking Vraska, just letting it go. Probably 4 times I didn't even uptick Vraska. I'm missing very obvious sequences. I'm trying to play multiple non-creature spells into my own Deafening Silence, the card that is defining the whole game. I'm still forgetting about it and playing multiple cards into it. And just as I just keep making these mistakes, they just get worse and worse and worse. I'm more and more in my head, and I'm getting upset. And eventually Jessie's like, yep, you win. I can't beat you. And I give her a fist bump or whatever. And then I just kind of sit there and I just spiral. I get so upset that I didn't want to be playing in this draft. I didn't want to be here. I knew I was going to make punts, and then I made more punts than I have ever made. And I am dreading having to watch this back on the stream this Thursday. I'm not looking forward to it. And on top of that, I won the draft as the cube designer for putting in a card that doesn't belong in the cube. After the draft is so obvious, just not appropriate, because first of all, I've never seen anyone ever cast it before, because most of the time it's bad. It's not a good card. It's symmetrical. You have to be a very specific deck to take advantage of it, and you just draw it at the wrong time. It's a terrible top deck. It's just not a good card, and so it's not worth having a card that 95% of the time is awful and 5% of the time just shuts the door in an incredibly unfun way. So even though I was all right, I might make some mistakes. It's fine. I'm not a great Magic player. I don't need to be. That's not a point of pride for me. Being a good cube designer is a huge point of pride for me. And here, the cube design thing, this card being included is a huge blemish on the cube design, at least as far as I'm concerned. And I'm in this room with these 15 volunteers that have all contributed their time to this thing. I just start crying. I start crying because I'm so upset that I've ruined this whole thing, and everyone's like, what the fuck? Because I'm a 36-year-old man, and Anthony, I'm not afraid to, you know this probably. I almost never cry. I wish I could cry more. I've been working on it as an adult because if you grew up with my father,
try for 5 minutes every night before bed.
if you grew up with my father, I had like all crying as a child, like pretty strongly forced out of me, basically, and in like the most toxic masculine way imaginable. So I've like actively as an adult been trying like, hey, sometimes sad things happen and it actually feels good to cry. It's like endorphins and all that's good and stuff, and trying to like rid myself of the shame of that when like something emotional happens and I have a chance to cry. And I still almost can't, right? Like it's still been 14 months since I last cried. And then I'm crying in a stupid Magic game that I won. I won the game, and I was just like, the most shame I've ever felt. Like, I was so ashamed for these poor people that were like, what do we do around this weirdo? And it was just like, it was a really like disorienting experience. Like I was like, and you know, in hindsight, it's been a bad week for politics. It's been a bad week for news. My dog was sick. I had to like update my trains multiple times the day prior when I was traveling. I was like figuring out if I was going to go to this event in Philadelphia or not. I was under a lot of weird stress. And then just this like cascade of like the event was going perfectly. Everyone's playing so well. The coverage games are so interesting. And then I come in and I just shit the bed and make misplay after misplay and unforced error after unforced error and still win, in spite of Jesse being a much better player and in game one showing how awesome this matchup could be, because I could have absolutely won that game. If cards had just fallen slightly differently, or if I had held up mana into my Viridian Revel draws, I could have just won that game. My deck has all the tools it needs, and then I sideboard in this card that is not necessary, that just ruins everything that I, as a cube designer, shouldn't have put in there, and it just like ruins the whole event. And then I had to like try to explain to these nice people like why I was getting so upset. And of course, like I'm trying so hard not to get upset. And then once you try not to get upset, and like Jesse was like, "Hey, you okay?" And I was like, it was a huge mess. And I really debated sharing it here too, because it's really embarrassing to even tell the story. But I think it highlights like,
I don't think it is embarrassing. You had a lot of little factors and a lot of pressure that you're putting on yourself, and that's.
It's interesting. It's the hardest lesson I've ever learned in cube design, which is why I wanted to share it, because I don't know. It's like, I even looked at the list ahead of time, like going into the event. I was like, is there anything in here that's like really just has a high potential for unfun? And there's a lot of things that can be really powerful.
And you're like, aura shards.
Well, but look, here's the thing. One of the players did have aura shards. It was actually the featured drafter who won a match and got to play a bunch of aura shards with it. And I watched decks also beat it, right? Like Jesse's deck that could beat all of my interaction can also beat aura shards, because that's sorcery speed. So all the like counterplay also exists in this cube. And so if that had gone wrong, at least you were getting to see aura shards be broken in like a cool, unique way, because when have you ever seen aura shards do exactly this? Deafening silence, there's no interest to it at all. Nothing interesting about it at all. So it was really intense. It was like super late. We were like going over the recording thing, and they were like, I knew they were going to record an interview with me afterwards, because that was the plan, to like do the whole like draft event and then record like deck text with all the featured players afterwards, because they had to move all the lights and cameras, so they didn't want to do it in between. So I was like trying to make my face look normal so I could like do a deck tech.
Look normal.
Anyway, I just wanted to share that. That was how my tournament went. And then after this, I was like, you know, I wish I was going to Vertex, but also I'm not mad that I'm going home to sleep it off for a couple days, because I'm like emotionally hungover from this event. And I mean, obviously, I like logically, my logic brain knows that like this is not going to ruin the fundraiser. Like some people are probably there's probably going to be a snarky comment or two about the like dumb idiot that punted a bunch but still won the finals. Like there are probably going to be a number of people that are like, wow, deafening silence probably doesn't belong in this cube. And you know what? They're right. That's going to happen. Whatever. It's not like people are going to not donate to the union because of this, right? It doesn't actually affect the thing. But in that moment, I was just like, I ruined everything. I ruined everything with my cube design. I didn't know cube design could ruin everything. And then I came home and slept. Shoo! This is Editing Andy, having now watched the live stream back, seen these games from the coverage perspective for the first time, and there's a couple things I want to touch on. First of all, going back to game one, I actually think the last two turns here were pretty interesting and worth getting the details right. Here is what happened. I had Requisition Raid in my hand and 6 lands available, and what I intended to do on my last turn of the game, the turn before Jesse turned the corner and won, Jesse already had Bloodbond March in play and a handful of Ornithopters, and what I intended to do, I looked at my mana, I had 6 of it, I had Bow of Nile in play, which costs 2 mana to activate, and I have Requisition Raid, which costs 4 mana for all the modes. I had seen Jesse a turn or two prior resolve an Ad Nauseam and put a negate in her hand, so I knew she had a negate. I knew this requisition rate wasn't going to resolve, but I was like, well, I've got 4 mana to spend, and I can still hold up by Bow of Nylea. So I went for the requisition raid with all modes to destroy the Bloodbond March, destroy one of her Ornithopters, and put a +1 counter on my 2 Ornithopters, with the idea that I still have that 2 mana up for Bow of Nylea, which gives me more options on Jesse's turn. I did not think about the drawing into disenchant option, which in hindsight I should have. But I didn't actually execute the line that I planned, because what I did is I tapped a land for mana, I sacrificed it to Vraska's ability to draw a card and gain a life to see if I drew anything better than that plan I just laid out. I didn't. And then I went to cast the all modes requisition raid for 4 mana, and I forgot about my floating mana from the sacrificed land. You can see me do it on coverage. I tap 3 lands, I announce the all modes spreed requisition raid, and then I look down and I count my lands again and go, ooh, I guess I miscounted, and I tap another land, thus tapping me out of Bow of Nylea mana. I'm not sure how this turn would have turned out if I had realized that I had that floating mana and had Bow of Nylea up. I think there's a good chance I maybe could have won, but I think I definitely would have won if I had thought really big-brained about just casting Requisition Raid for 1 mode, just destroy Bloodbond March, because the counters on my Ornithopters and destroying one of her Ornithopters really doesn't matter. That's not a factor in the game. I just thought I had free mana to play with. If I had done that for 2 mana, held up 2 mana for Bow of Nylea, and still had 2 mana up for the disenchant I was likely to draw off of my Viridian Revel, should Jesse figure out a way to go off, I think that's kind of a bulletproof sequence that I just didn't quite see. A really interesting turn that I think I had a decent plan for. Not the best plan, certainly, but a decent plan for, except I just forgot about my floating mana, which is a dumb punt. 2 other things to mention. One is that in the other matches that were on coverage, not the one I was playing in, not the finals, I mostly didn't see them in person. I got to see the end of Jesse's match with Jason at the end of round 2, which ended in a spectacular fashion. I won't spoil the details, but go check that out if you want to see how that game ends. I saw that game and I was really excited about that, and I had heard from the people that were working the event that, like, oh, people got to go off with all these combo pieces, and sure enough, Rebel did get to go off a Paradox Engine and Quicksilver Dagger, and it was really cool, and Jason got to do all of the fun stuff with Thrumming Stone. Those things did happen, but also those games did have a lot of the hallmarks of games in this cube when the players are new to the environment and the decks are maybe a little clunkier than people that have played the cube a bunch before, which were maybe not as exciting to watch as I had thought. There were exciting moments, but there was also a lot of boring stalled boards and just waiting for someone to top deck something, which is something I'm always working on improving with the cube. But just to say that if you watch it back, I previously said those games were amazing, and turns out they were actually just fine. So more work to do in the cube design front. Then finally, my mistakes in Game 3 that felt so profoundly embarrassing to me at the time and so obvious and dumb were not anywhere near as obvious on coverage as I assumed they would be. I mean, honestly, I think chat spent more time talking about the mistakes from Game 2, the one I just sort of broke down in detail, than the more obvious mistakes I made in Game 3, because it was kind of a big, complicated board, and honestly, it didn't matter if I missed my Vraska uptick, which I think I only missed it once or twice, actually, not 4 times, so really my perception's off there. Yeah, it just wasn't, you can't really tell from watching the coverage that I'm punting as hard as I am punting and feeling really bad about it. So if you do listen to this story and you go back and watch that match, I just wanted to acknowledge that, yeah, you know, when you're in a really vulnerable, emotional place, your perceptions of reality are maybe different than others around you. So thanks for indulging me in a lengthy addendum here in the editing booth. I don't know what I expect you to say in response to that story. But
I feel for you. I'm sorry that was so stressful. I'm just thinking about
I ain't reading all that, but I'm sorry that happened.
How are you going to explain Magic the Gathering to your therapist? It's going to be difficult.
Oh, she knows all about Magic the Gathering. And yeah, it's like I made a breakthrough in the crying thing, maybe. But also I felt
You'll be delighted
red hot shame. I felt so much red hot shame. And yeah. Anyway. So I'm cutting deafening silence from the cube.
Yeah, that's probably a good first step.
And I did actively want to record this before Thursday. We'll see what kind of feels I'm in on that day about it. I don't know. We'll see.
I'm sure it'll
I'm really dreading watching it back. I'm not looking forward to it at all. It's going to be so bad. Get to watch me slowly melt down as Jesse's just like, I can't do anything about deafening silence. Yeah. And I'm like, forget to uptick Nissa, forget this card draw trigger, just whatever.
I also totally empathize with that specific aspect. I mean, obviously, operating under stress, you're going to start making mistakes. And it's we talk about that a lot about cube design, where people are like, why are you so caught up in all this complexity? Complexity is not an issue. I can read this card and understand it. It's sure, but can you read
Yeah.
That in the context of you've just read 36 other cards.
I put all these cards in the cube, Anthony.
And
I put Deafening Silence in the cube, and I didn't play with it at all, even remotely correctly.
And I also feel like sometimes it is more difficult or more overwhelming when you're way ahead in a game. I've played so many games that where I'm way ahead and it's like I'm just making completely asinine decisions, because when you're behind, often it's like I love
playing from behind. It's so clarifying.
Cut away every possibility that doesn't work. It's like, can I attack here and win? No, I can't. Okay. Am I going to die next turn if I don't attack? No. Okay. So what's left? What are my few options to get through this narrow band of options? When you're way ahead, it's like, what are my options? Yeah, all of these move the game forward somewhat. All these things are good.
Yeah, it comes back to the question of, do you want to be asking the questions or answer them? I answer them because I know what the question is. Otherwise, it's I guess the question is, should you uptick your Planeswalker? Yes, you should uptick your Planeswalker.
But what if they have a destroy target Planeswalker? What if they have the Elder Spell? And then they're going to take all of your
I also
loyalty
have
counters.
all of the knowledge that they don't have the Elder Spell, and there's no way to punish upticking a Planeswalker in this cube. I think Vraska's actually cool here, though, I will say. The ultimate on Vraska just says your creatures win the game if they hit your opponent, which is a cool...
You still need to give them power.
You still have to give them power, which is... I won the game a lot in previous matches that way, and it was just a kind of cool way to do it, I think, that was still very on theme. Anyway, you got to go to a thing. That's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio / tournament report /
looking forward to the stream.
Emotional confession.
I guess.
I'm looking forward to the first 3/4 of the stream. It's going to be great. And then I might just disappear from the chat when it ends.
Just don't go on the internet. You don't need to be there. God. Don't read the comments.
I'm not going to read the comments, I don't think. We'll see.
I'm glad Sadie's okay.
All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and speaking into microphones about it. If we read any card text wrong on this episode, that was to bait you for engagement, so don't leave that comment. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for being emotionally vulnerable and sharing your deep, deep shames.
I'm a little too vulnerable the past few days, it feels.
I hope you feel okay right now.
Yeah, I feel fine right now. I mean, the thing is, in my life broadly, I feel like I don't have much shame. I don't feel particularly embarrassed telling this story, even though in the moment I felt this red hot shame. But I'm yeah, it's just a thing that happens. I don't know. Shame is not an emotion that governs almost any of my life. But every once in a while, if you're not planning for it, it gets you.
Sneaks up on you.
Yeah.